Welcome back, folks. Today we're studying the work of Sherwood Anderson. Anderson was a lost generation writer. He was an American novelist and short story writer, best known for subjective self-revealing works, self-educated. He rose to become a successful copywriter and business owner in Cleveland and Elyria, Ohio. In 1912, he had a nervous breakdown that led him to abandon the business and family to become a writer. At the time he moved to Chicago, he was eventually married 3 additional times. His most enduring work was the short story sequence Winesburg, Ohio, which launched his career. Throughout the 20s, Anderson published several short story collections, novels, memoirs, books, essays, and a book of poetry. Through his books, though his books sold reasonably well, Dark Laughter in 1925, a novel inspired by Anderson's time in New Orleans during the 1920s, was his only bestseller. Anderson died on March 8, 1941, at the age of 64. He took ill while on a cruise to South America. He'd been feeling abdominal discomfort for a few days, which was diagnosed as peritonitis. Anderson and his wife debarked from the cruise liner Santa Lucia and went to the hospital in Colon, Panama, where he died on March 8th. An autopsy revealed that he'd swallowed a toothpick and done internal damage, resulting in the peritonitis. Anderson's body was returned to the United States, where he was buried at Round Hill Cemetery in Marion, Virginia. His epitaph reads, "Life, not death, is the great adventure." All right. Which brings us to our story, Hands, from Winesburg, Ohio. Now, in the intro of Winesburg, Ohio, he talks about he does something really kind of fascinating. He talks about the artist, and the artist is himself, actually. He's revealing himself to you in this part, telling you what he's going to tell you in the story, and tells you about about the town where he's writing about. Okay, so the novel Winesburg, Ohio reveals the existential dread that kind of marked the modern age through its cast of characters. Each one of these is a person desperately struggling, trying to cope with the modernist dilemma. Remember, the modernists are the ones who supposedly killed God. Nietzsche making the claim that God is dead, suggesting that most of which had been previously described and explained by the supernatural now is understood by science and that sort of thing. So we have a group of people who kind of torn free of their moorings. Right? When you remove something as large as God from the equation, you have a vast empty space where he was. And the modernists continued to try to fill that with absolutely no luck. Right? As we'll see in some of our upcoming stories and lectures, especially the work of Hemingway in The Sun Also Rises. But anyway, there's a great deal of fear and restlessness here among the town's residents. So let's start off with Hands. We have our protagonist, Wing Biddlebaum, something of a local character who's lived in the town for about 20 years. No one gives him much thought, right? Nobody really thinks of him as anything other than just sort of a local character. Not until he connects with the novel's most prominent character, George Willard, who is a reporter for the local paper. Most folks in the town view him with a species of admiration because of his hands. Right? The hands are always moving. He's always productive in what he can do with them. His hands are always in motion. Very tactile character. There's a hint of perhaps same-sex attraction here, perhaps even pedophilia. But more than likely what that is moral panic. He is one of those people who is a very touchy-feely kind of guy. And we know from things that happened to him in the town, which caused him to flee to Winesburg, Ohio, that his innocuous and otherwise innocent actions were seen as weird or improper, morally corrupt. Right? He sees the potential in George here, and the way a teacher would. A teacher often, will look for potential in students and celebrate and want to encourage it. However, he recoils in horror after he touches George. He just reaches out and touches him in a very sort of fatherly gesture or an affectionate gesture, and he's terrified. He recoils because of what happened to him previously. Anderson tells us that Wing has a history and a backstory. He was a teacher in Pennsylvania, and he was a bit too touchy-feely with his students. Right? In touching them, he connected with them in the way that they came to see what he was teaching to them. And in touching his students, he's connecting with them so they can see what he's trying to teach them. One of his special needs students, though, developed a crush on him, and he dreamed of him in the night, and he took the dream for truth. Right? He misunderstood. The child was perhaps not had some mental difficulties, some developmental issues, and so he couldn't distinguish between the dream and reality. And so in his dream, when he dreamed that his teacher had been improper with him, he couldn't distinguish between one and the other. And so this created a moral panic among the parents, who basically, pardon me flipping my notes here, who basically formed the equivalent of a lynch mob. So Wing, who was innocent of anything other than being perhaps a little too affectionate or a little too touchy-feely for the common folk, gets beaten almost senseless by this lynch mob. He flees to Winesburg to live with an aunt in the area, and he changed his name to Wing Biddlebaum. Spent a year recovering from and unsure of what had caused his misfortune, only that it had something to do with his hands. So ultimately, I think Wing is a tragic character here, right? He was punished for something, did something wrong, but had no concept of it, had no idea what it was or what it might have been that caused people to recoil and to rise up angrily and to hurt him, to chase him out of town. Remember, they never told him what he did wrong, right? They never made any accusation. Nor did they give him a chance to account for himself or defend himself. This is how moral panic works. It's kind of the same thing that gave us the Salem witch trials. There's actually a brief video from them about moral panic from the series Legion on FX that I use to, discuss the importance of argumentation in 102. If you look up moral panic on YouTube along with Legion, it's worth watching. Gives you an idea of kind of what happens here and how people tend to, mobs tend to fuel each other. People tend to get upset over things when they don't fully understand, and often the results are tragic. So it wasn't until he met George, a brilliant young man, so like his students, that he became energized again and that he became a teacher again. He would have these long conversations, and when he touched George, he became afraid again. He remembered that his hands had gotten him in trouble. Right? In a particularly sad passage, he dines alone in the house like a priest praying to the rosary as if he's paying penance for daring to touch George. So what are the takeaways? The world is cruel to that which does not understand. Right? People tend to attack people who are different. It's part of the sort of primitive survival method here, some survival instinct. There's something bizarre or out of place in the group, and you don't belong, so we've got to expel you. Number 2, moral panic. Once it takes root, the destructiveness is almost impossible to contain. It can't read my notes. Sorry. It is as prevalent now as it was in Salem. Right? And finally, everyone has a story, a backstory. Wing Biddlebaum had this backstory, and this poor guy, he was just a teacher. He was very good at what he did, but people couldn't understand, right? People couldn't understand him, and they didn't understand his affection toward the boys was nothing more than just him being a tactile person. And they looked at him as somehow perverse. You could possibly read him the other way. You could read him as perhaps a gay character. A queer theory reading of this story would suggest that he was attacked because he was different and because he different in that respect. He was different because he had a same-sex attraction. Right? But there's a big difference between homosexuality and pedophilia. Keep that in mind. So, anyway, Wing Biddlebaum is kind of a sad and tragic character, in my humble opinion. He was an educator who became the focus of a moral panic. There was no opportunity given to him for him to defend himself, to explain what had happened, or to correct the error from the special needs kid. And so now he has this internalized trauma that causes him to think the problem is with my hands. I did something wrong, and it had something to do with my hands. Yeah. Ultimately, a very sad story. Anyway, I highly recommend the rest of the novel. Sherwood Anderson, one of the Lost Generation writers here, the group that came back from World War I with a very jaundiced kind of view of the world. That was Hands by Sherwood Anderson. I highly recommend the novel. It's filled with amazing stories, and I'd highly recommend the book. Okay, so I'll see you in the next video, and we'll talk to you later.